Kerev Halev al hakavod hagadol shenatatem lanu. Now I'll spare you my biblical Hebrew. I know I speak for all the honored and distinguished recipients of this degree and for their families who are here today when I express appreciation and enormous pleasure in being invited to join this incredibly distinguished community of scholars by being honorary participants in the Technion's mission to repair the world. The Technion is not only the brains of Israel, it is the heart and the soul of this wonderful and complicated country. Israel and the Technion have saved so many lives through its medical innovations. My wife and I were privileged to go and see the medical school today, and go to the Rambam Hospital and meet with some of the great doctors who work here. And it's simply remarkable what you have had to do under extraordinary circumstances. What other hospital in the world has to build reinforced basement concrete centers to protect against the possibilities of not only conventional but unconventional attacks? And yet, in the face of all of these difficulties, you have provided so much health benefit to the world at large. You have helped feed the world through agricultural innovations such as drip technology. You've protected the planet through your great environmental innovations. And you have increased the knowledge of the world through your pure scientific research. We live in New York City, my wife and I, right opposite Roosevelt Island. And we look out every day in anticipation of what you will give, not only to New York City, but to the world when this new Technion Cornell Center is eventually built. I hope to be there not only when the first building opens in 2017, but I'm working hard, working out, so I can be there when the school is completed in 2043. With technology from Technion, life expectancies are increasing dramatically. Anybody can dispute the following two statements. Number one, no country in the history of the world has contributed more to humanity in 66 years than the nation state of the Jewish people. Can anybody And no university in history has contributed more to humanity in less than a century than the Technion. Think about it. That's the good news. Now for the bad news. Public opinion polls, particularly in Europe, show that Israel is regarded as among the worst countries in the world on many scales. For example, a BBC poll of 30,000 people from 25 countries asked the following question about every country in the world. Do you consider the influence of this country positive or negative? In last place, not surprising, was Iran. In next to last place was Pakistan. Tied for third in last place was North Korea and Israel. Imagine that. Just imagine that. First, and think of the irony of where these countries were 70 years ago, were Japan and Germany, tied for first place as the best country in the world that has contributed and had the most positive influence. Now just think about it for a minute and compare what Japan has contributed to the world since the end of the Second World War with what Israel has contributed to the world since its establishment in 1948. There is simply no comparison. And yet Israel is listed and ranked by these public opinion polls as worse than Afghanistan, Russia, Zimbabwe, Cuba, Iraq, Yemen, Venezuela, Syria, Sudan, Nigeria, Myanmar, Libya, and a cold welcome to this terrible list, Greece. So why? Why? How can you explain this disturbing phenomenon? The first argument one hears is always, well, we acknowledge Israel has made major contributions in science and technology. We don't dispute that, but you don't judge a country on its scientific accomplishments alone. You have to look at a broader perspective. You have to look at its human rights record. And when I speak on colleges and universities around the world, I always issue the following challenge. And I say, shout out the answer. Name a country in history faced with threats, internal and external, comparable to those faced by Israel. Name a country that has had a better record of human rights, that has shown more concern for civilians and avoiding civilian casualties, and I always get silence. No one can think of a country. Does that mean Israel's perfect? No. Does that mean there haven't been other countries that have struggled hard with the dilemma of fighting against terrorism or fighting against external enemies and trying to balance it against civil liberties? Of course many countries have. No country has been better than Israel. Let me quote for you Justice William Brennan, perhaps the most liberal justice in modern American history. And when he came to America at the invitation of former President Aaron Barak of the Supreme Court, he came back to the United States, it was just before 9/11, and he said, if God forbid terrorism were ever to come to our shores, there is only one country from which we could learn how to strike the appropriate balance between preventing terrorism and depriving people of human rights. And that country is Israel. And so the second argument is a very interesting one. It's an argument that's called pinkwashing. Where does pinkwashing come from? It comes from an op-ed in the New York Times in which a professor at one of the New York City colleges acknowledged, she was a gay, lesbian woman, she was a head of a society association, she acknowledged that Israel was among the best countries in the world when it came to gay rights. My wife and I were just in Tel Aviv. We saw 100,000 people celebrating sexual diversity, and she acknowledged that certainly no country in this region is better. There are very few in the world that have had a better record. But she said there's a sinister reason why Israel is so positive in the area of gay rights. It's to pinkwash, that is whitewash, but with the color pink, its abysmal record with regard to Palestinians. And that article and that argument has caught on. And the pinkwashing argument has been extended also to scientific developments. Yes, to be sure, Israel has made scientific innovations and great scientific progress, and yes, it helps save the lives of people, but it's all part of a calculated plot to wash, to make sure the world doesn't focus on the darker side of Israel. And so all of Israel's scientific accomplishments are turned against it, the same way that all of Israel's moral accomplishments are turned against it by this argument. And what's the third argument? The third argument is an argument of moral equivalence. Oh, yes, Israel has had to deal with some of these problems, but, you know, it's no better than its enemies. There is no real difference between kidnapping 3 young children and fighting against terrorism and accidentally, perhaps, killing somebody in the course of trying to stop a rocket that is hidden among civilian casualties. Ban Ki-moon made that argument just the other day when he condemned the kidnapping, but talked about it as part of a cycle of violence, as if it were parallel to other kinds of activities. So the head of the Human Rights Watch couldn't bring himself to simply condemn the kidnapping. What he said is, despite the fact that these people attended an illegal yeshiva in an illegal settlement, there's still no justification for them being kidnapped. That's the best you can get out of Human Rights Watch. And at least as of this afternoon, the European community had not weighed in. When Israel issues a number of permits for buildings, nobody waits to condemn. It's there, it's on the front page, it's right out there. But when Israel suffers from terrorism, it's page 26 at the bottom of the page. And the Goldstone Report, of course, contributed to that. It created a sense of moral equivalence. It said, yeah, on the one hand, there were rockets. On the other hand, there's Israel's attack, without seeking to differentiate rockets, which are a double war crime. They are sent from civilian areas purposely. They are often from the backyards of schools or the backyards of hospitals, and they are directed at civilian targets, a double war crime. Whereas what Israel does in prevention or in defense is to try as hard as it can to target only combatants. Of course, no one can be absolutely perfect in targeting combatants, especially when the combatants are hidden among civilians. And so people forget and talk about a moral equivalence. People talk about a moral equivalence in the peace process between Israel and the Palestinian Authority, forgetting that Israel offered a two-state solution in 1948 when it accepted the UN resolution and the Palestinian leadership rejected it. Again in 1967 when the leaders were waiting by the phone for a call from Jordan and Egypt. Again in 2000 and 2001 when the Clinton-Barack parameters were offered. Again when Ehud Olmert offered his very generous proposal. There is no moral equivalence when it comes to the peace process. Does that mean Israel can't do more? It can do more. Does that mean that none of us is entitled to be critical of particular Israeli policies? Of course we are. But we're talking about the need for nuance, the need for calibration, the need for, let me say it, science, the need to look at these things scientifically and to elevate truth. I guess it was Martin Buber who said truth is not what it used to be. And I think that's what's going on in the world today. When it comes to Israel, truth is not what it used to be. And then there's the fourth argument, the honest argument. The argument that goes something like this. Oh, we know that there's no moral equivalence, so we know that the Israelis are trying to, but we expect more of the nation state of the Jewish people. We expect more. Now that's a legitimate argument if you're an Israeli. If you're an Israeli, you can demand more of your country. As an American, I can demand more of my country. But a Presbyterian leader in Michigan cannot demand more of a state because it's the nation state of the Jewish people. The Vatican can't demand more. The European community can't demand more. What right do they have to impose a double standard? And let me tell you, even if you had imposed a double standard, Israel would do quite well if there were an honest assessment of the complexities that are faced by a nation surrounded by hostile enemies, with some even within its borders. Now, at least this argument acknowledges the fact that Israel is judged by a double standard because it is the nation state of the Jewish people. Israel is today the Jew among nations. Let there be no doubt about that. You cannot understand the passion, the hatred. A friend of mine called it eroticized hatred. You cannot understand unless you try to stand up and make a talk on Israel, a balanced talk, a talk that favors the two-state solution, a talk that's critical of the settlements. And you see the hatred. You see people shouting in the audience, Dershowitz, Goebbels, it's just the same. The only difference is the name. The hatred, the passion, the feelings, they're irrational. And the irrationality doesn't grow only out of Israel's policies. Now, let me be very clear. I'm not suggesting that criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic. Believe me, it's not. If it were, mere criticism of Israeli policy is anti-Semitic. The largest concentration of anti-Semites in the world would be in Tel Aviv. It's fair, it's right. When you love a country, you criticize it. But the level of criticism, the degree of criticism, the demonization, the delegitimation is just not explainable on rational or scientific terms, or terms of truth. You cannot understand it unless you understand that Israel is the Jew among nations. Can you imagine another country in a comparable situation, and there have been others around the world, which maybe extends its occupation too long, maybe did settlements that shouldn't be built? You can take all of those arguments and accept them. Can anybody imagine that level of hatred? listing Israel where it's listed in those polls, it is not a rational decision. And it cannot be defeated by purely rational acts. And that's why I think it's absolutely important to separate the issue of what Israel does from the issues of how people respond to what Israel does. How should Israel fight BDS, which is itself a symptom of this double standard, a symptom of this hatred? And it's a symptom that's having a big effect because it's impacting on young students in Europe, certainly young students in the United States as well. And there are those, many in Israel, who say the answer is just improve Israel's policies. If you just improve Israel's policies, if you do what the Europeans want it to do, if you do what Human Rights Watch wants it to do, if you immediately end the occupation, immediately go back to the 67 lines, immediately do all of those things, this will end. It will not. The bad news is, even if Israel were to do everything the international community and the hard left and many in Israel demanded it, even if they were to do everything correct, much of the demonization, not all, but much, would remain. Remember, the DBS movement, although it claims to be focused on the territories, claims to be focused on the occupation, is led by people who say that the occupation extends to Haifa and to Tel Aviv, and Palestine will be free from the river to the sea. They seek a one-state solution. That's the goal of BDS. And if Israel were to do everything the BDS people claim they want, that would diminish the impact of BDS, but it wouldn't reduce it. It would diminish the impact of demonization and delegitimation, but it wouldn't eliminate it. That's the bad news. The good news is that Israel will continue to do what is in Israel's best interest and what its values as a nation demand of it. It should not be putting its fingers to the wind and asking how the pollsters will react. It should be doing the right thing. It should be doing it in response to Israel's democratic and value orientation. It should do the right thing. If you think the right thing is whatever you think it is, argue for it. Push for it. Vote for it. Do everything in your power, but don't demonize Israel if you disagree with its policy judgments. You can demonize particular politicians, but the idea of delegitimating Israel because of disagreements over policy, it's the only country where the Guardian would have an editorial saying we disagree with Israel's policies in building a wall, and that raises doubts about Israel's right to exist as the nation state of the Jewish people. What other country does criticism translate into delegitimation so quickly? And so we must fight BDS. We must fight the trends that are now moving in the wrong direction. We must fight against BDS independently of doing the right thing for the nation state of Israel. And how to fight BDS? Well, there's one very good way of doing it. And that is making it impossible for the world to do without Israeli scholars, Israeli artists, Israeli scientists, and other innovators. The best answer to DBS is for Israel to be so important and to contribute so much to the international community, to its welfare, that the world cannot do without the products that are made and created and innovated in Israel. The best defense against BDS is Technion. The Technion has been the leader and the innovator in creating products and in creating research and in making it impossible for the world to do without Israeli scholars. I'll tell you an interesting story. A few years ago, there was an effort to create a boycott of Israeli academics. And at that point, just two of us, Professor Steve Weinberg, who won the Nobel Prize, who's a professor at the University of Texas, and I decided to write a little letter just saying, if you boycott Israeli academics, we want you to know
that we regard ourselves as Israeli academics for purposes of any boycott. Both of us had degrees from Israeli universities. We thought we'd get maybe a few dozen people to sign on. We got 11,000 academics from around the world to join this campaign. If you boycott a single Israeli academic, you will be boycotted by 11,000 academics, and you will not be able to withstand that boycott. Now, that's the hard boycott. There is in existence also the soft boycott. Universities not boycotting, nothing official, just rejecting papers done by Israelis, just accepting only papers that are done by Israelis if their politics are anti-Israel. It's a soft form of academic boycott, and it's much, much harder to fight. But again, the way to fight it is to just be better, to just improve and increase the quality of the scholarship, the quality of the innovation. Will it work completely? No, but it will contribute immeasurably toward Israel's success. And it will mean that Israel is doing the right thing. Israel must, first and foremost, defend its people. And the Technion must continue to do that work. My wife and I recently just went and visited the tunnels in Gaza, the very tunnels that were used to capture a previous Israeli person who was held for a long time. And what are these tunnels? They're not tunnels for smuggling goods. They are terrorist tunnels. They have one purpose. They dig under the ground. The one we just saw landed in front of a kindergarten with 50 or so children, and the goal of the people who dug the tunnel was to kill or kidnap as many kindergarten children as possible. Now, the people who are in charge of finding these tunnels have found it to be somewhat, the world it is a challenge. It is a scientific challenge to find these tunnels when they're in the process of being built. And of course, the Technion is actively involved today in doing that. And it should be actively involved. That's good science, that's just application of science, that's good morality, and that's good human rights. Now, I was asked to speak on behalf of the honorees in accepting this. I don't expect that all the honorees will agree with everything I have said, but I'm sure we will all agree that we are proud to be part of the Technion family, and that we are confident that this great institution of learning, research, and innovation will continue to go forward from strength to strength. Thank you all.